The lecture hall fell silent as Zekthor walked to the front of the room. His scales, once a bright green, had faded to a dull gray over the years. Scars covered his arms and chest, each one a reminder of battles fought long ago. The young Krillian cadets watched him with wide eyes, curious about the famous veteran who stood before them. Zekthor looked out at the sea of young faces. They were so eager, so confident. They had no idea what war truly meant. They had never faced an enemy like the humans. He hoped his stories would teach them something their textbooks could not. "I want to tell you about the humans," Zekthor began, his voice rough from age. "I want to tell you why we fear them, why we made peace with them, and why you should pray we never fight them again." The cadets leaned forward in their seats. Stories of the human war were rare. Most veterans refused to speak about it. The memories were too painful, too disturbing. "It started at Proxima Station," Zekthor continued. "We had intercepted a human colony ship. Just civilians trying to reach a new world. We thought it would be easy. Take the ship, capture the colonists, use them as leverage against Earth. Simple." He paused, remembering that day with perfect clarity. The confidence he had felt, the certainty of victory. The colony ship had one escort, a small destroyer called Liberty's Call. One ship against our entire battle group. 12 of our finest warships against one human vessel. We sent them a message demanding their surrender. We told them to hand over the colonists, and we would let the crew live. Zekthor's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Their captain was named Jake Morrison, a young human, barely older than you, cadets. He sent back a reply that I will never forget. He said, "You'll have to go through us first, and I promise you'll pay for every life in blood." One of the cadets laughed nervously. The idea of one ship challenging 12 seemed absurd. "We thought he was bluffing," Zekthor said. "We thought he would run when we opened fire. We were wrong." The battle replayed in Zekthor's mind like it had happened yesterday. The human destroyer had moved with impossible speed, dancing between the Krillian ships like a fighter instead of a warship. Morrison had used every trick, every tactic, every desperate maneuver to buy time for the colony ship to escape. They fought like nothing we had ever seen. Zekthor told the cadets. "We hit them with weapons that should have destroyed them instantly. But they kept fighting. Their ship was on fire, losing atmosphere, breaking apart. But they kept fighting." He walked to the display screen and pulled up old battle footage. The cadets watched as the human destroyer traded shots with multiple Krillian vessels at once. Explosions tore through the human ship. Sections broke off and tumbled into space. But still, it fought. Their tactical officer was a woman named Emma Hayes, Zekthor said. She coordinated their retreat. She calculated jump points while their ship was being torn apart around her. She worked in a room that had lost pressure, wearing a damaged spacesuit, with half her console destroyed. The footage showed the colony ship jumping to faster than light speed, disappearing to safety. The human destroyer had succeeded. The civilians were safe. Morrison could have run then. Zekthor said quietly. His mission was complete. The colonists had escaped. He could have jumped away and survived. But he didn't. The old soldier's voice grew heavy. He stayed. He kept fighting. He drew our fire away from the jump point to make sure the colony ship got away clean. And he made us pay. The battle footage showed what happened next. The human destroyer, crippled and dying, rammed one of the Krillian cruisers. The explosion was massive. Both ships were destroyed instantly. But the debris field from the collision damaged 2 more Krillian vessels so badly they had to withdraw. 4 of our ships, Zekthor said. One human destroyer took 4 of our ships out of the battle. And when we recovered the wreckage, when we boarded what was left of their vessel, we found something that changed everything. He paused, making sure every cadet was listening. The crew had fought to the last person. Not the last soldier. The last person. Engineers, medical staff, even the cook. When our boarding teams entered the wreck, They found humans with handheld weapons, still trying to fight even though their ship was dead and the battle was over. Some had used tools as weapons. Others had fought with their bare hands. Zekthor pulled up images of the wreckage. The cadets stared in silence at the frozen bodies of the human crew, still at their stations, still fighting even in death. Morrison died on his bridge, Zekthor said. He had been wounded 3 times but refused medical treatment. He stayed in command until the very end. Hayes died at her station, calculating one final jump solution that she never got to use. The entire crew of 215 humans died defending a ship that was already lost. One of the cadets raised a hand. "Teacher, why didn't they surrender? They could have lived. Their mission was complete." "I'm Saul," Zekthor nodded slowly. "That is the question that haunted me for years. Why fight when defeat is certain? Why die when survival is possible? I didn't understand it then, but I understand it now." He looked at each cadet in turn. "Humans don't fight for victory alone. They fight for each other." Morrison and his crew died so that 40,000 colonists could live. They chose death so others could have life. And they made that choice, without hesitation, without regret. The room was completely silent now. The cadets had stopped taking notes. They simply listened. "We reported the battle as a victory," Zekthor said. "And it was a victory by the numbers. We lost 4 ships. They lost 1. But something changed that day. We realized we were fighting an enemy who valued different things than we did. An enemy who would choose death over surrender if it meant protecting their people." He turned off the display screen. The images of the destroyed human ship faded away. "That was my first lesson about humans," Zekthor concluded. "They do not surrender when others depend on them. They do not calculate odds the way we do. They do not see death as the worst outcome. And that makes them the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy." That. The cadets sat in stunned silence as Zekthor returned to his seat. They had come to hear stories of glorious battles and easy victories. Instead, they had learned something far more important. They had learned to fear an enemy who refused to be defeated, no matter the cost. The next day, Zekthor returned to the lecture hall. The cadets were already seated, waiting for him. Word had spread about his first lecture. Now the room was packed with students who wanted to hear more about the human war. Zekthor stood at the front and began without preamble. "Today, I will tell you about Titan, about the siege that lasted 8 months, about the day we learned that humans prepare for war like no other species in the galaxy." He pulled up a map of Saturn's largest moon. Titan was a human military base. They had spent decades building it into a fortress. We knew it would be difficult to take, but we had an entire battle fleet. We had superior numbers and superior technology. We thought it would take a few weeks at most. The old veteran's expression darkened. "It took 8 months, and it cost us more than any battle in Krillian history." The cadets watched as Zekthor displayed images of Titan's surface: ice canyons, frozen plains, and crater fields stretched as far as the eye could see. "The humans had turned every crater into a weapons platform," Zekthor explained. "Every canyon was a kill zone with overlapping fields of fire. Every cave system was a tunnel network connecting defensive positions. They had studied warfare for their entire history, and it showed." He zoomed in on one section of the map. The commander was General Ryan Palmer, a man who understood that defense is not about holding ground. It's about making the enemy pay for every meter they advance. Zekthor began describing the first assault. Wave after wave of Krillian troops had landed on Titan's surface, expecting to overwhelm the defenders with numbers. Instead, they walked into a nightmare of prepared positions and coordinated fire. "We lost 3,000 soldiers in the first week," Zekthor said quietly. 3,000 of our best warriors, cut down by an enemy we could barely see. The humans fought from concealed positions, struck without warning, and vanished before we could respond. One cadet asked. Didn't we use orbital bombardment? Zekthor nodded. We did. We bombed Titan from orbit for days. We destroyed their surface installations, collapsed their above-ground structures, turned entire sections of the moon into molten craters. And still they fought. They simply moved underground and continued the battle from there. He pulled up footage of a particular engagement. This is Junction 7, a strategic choke point in the tunnel system. We needed to control it to advance deeper into the base. Commander Danny Foster held this position with 300 soldiers. The footage showed a wide tunnel intersection, with multiple passages branching off in different directions. It looked like an ordinary piece of infrastructure. But Zekthor knew better. That junction had become a graveyard. Palmer ordered Foster to hold Junction 7 for 6 hours. Zekthor said. That was how long it would take to evacuate the civilians through the escape tunnels. Foster acknowledged the order and got to work. The old soldier described what happened next. Foster had positioned his troops in a defensive formation that turned the junction into a killing field. Every approach was covered. Every angle was defended. The humans had prepared for this exact scenario. We threw 5,000 soldiers at that position, Zekthor said. 5,000 against 300. We thought we would crush them in an hour. But Foster's troops fought with a discipline and coordination we had never encountered. The battle had lasted 11 hours. Wave after wave of Krillian soldiers had tried to break through. Each time, they were thrown back with heavy losses. The humans used every weapon, every trick, every desperate tactic to hold the line. There was a lieutenant named Lisa Chen, Zekthor continued. She led a counterattack that shouldn't have been possible. While we were assaulting Junction 7, she took a squad of Marines and infiltrated our forward base. The cadets leaned forward, listening intently. Chen and her team spent 3 days in Saturn's radiation belt, Zekthor said. They wore captured Krillian environmental suits and moved through zones that should have killed them. They endured radiation levels that would have been fatal to my people. But humans are tougher than they look. Chen's squad had reached the Krillian supply depot and planted demolition charges on the fuel storage tanks. The resulting explosion had destroyed enough supplies to cripple the assault for days. She got her entire squad back to friendly lines, Zekthor said with something like admiration in his voice. 12 humans crossed a radiation-soaked hellscape, infiltrated enemy territory, destroyed our supplies, and made it home. When we captured one of her team members months later and asked how they survived, he just laughed and said humans are stubborn. But the true horror came at Junction 7. After 11 hours of fighting, the Krillian forces finally broke through the human defenses. What they found shocked even the most hardened veterans. 17 humans were still alive when we took the junction, Zekthor said softly. 17 out of 300. Every single one was wounded. Every single one was still fighting. They had run out of ammunition hours before but continued using improvised weapons, rocks, pieces of equipment, anything they could find. He paused, remembering the scene. Foster was among them. He had been shot 9 times. 9 times. But he was still giving orders, still coordinating his troops, still fighting. He died 20 minutes after we secured the position. His last words were asking if the evacuation was complete. The room was silent. The cadets struggled to process what they were hearing. It was complete, Zekthor continued. 40,000 human civilians escaped through the tunnels, while Foster and his troops held the line. 300 warriors died so 40,000 non-combatants could live. And they did it. Without hesitation, he looked at the young cadets. That is when I began to understand human warfare. They don't fight for territory or resources. They fight for each other, and they will pay any price, endure any suffering, die any death if it means their people survive. Zekthor pulled up more footage of the siege. Weeks of brutal combat. Krillian forces advancing meter by meter through prepared defenses. Human troops fighting from positions that should have been impossible to hold. We won the siege eventually, Zekthor said. We took Titan, but the cost was staggering. We lost 20,000 soldiers taking a base defended by 5,000. We spent 8 months on a battle that was supposed to take weeks. And even in defeat, the humans achieved their goal. The civilians escaped. The military equipment was destroyed, rather than captured. We won the ground but gained nothing of value. He turned off the display. Palmer surrendered only after every civilian was evacuated, and every piece of useful equipment was sabotaged. He walked out of his command center with his hands up, but he was smiling, because he had won the only victory that mattered to him. His people were safe. The cadets sat in silence as Zekthor finished his lecture. They had learned another lesson about humans. These strange, stubborn creatures would turn every battle into a bloodbath, would defend the undefendable, would die by the thousands for people they barely knew, and that made them enemies that could never truly be defeated. On the third day, even more cadets crowded into the lecture hall. Some stood along the walls when the seats filled up. Zekthor's stories had become the most talked-about lectures at the academy. The young Krillians wanted to understand the enemy that had forced their mighty empire to accept peace. Zekthor waited for silence before beginning. Today I will tell you about the ghosts, about the humans who refused to accept occupation, about the resistance that turned our victory into a nightmare. He displayed a map showing Krillian-controlled human colonies. Red zones covered most of the outer territories. At the height of the war, we controlled dozens of human worlds. We thought we had won. We thought the humans would accept their defeat and make peace. We were wrong. The old veteran pulled up a file marked with high security clearance. The humans called them the Phantoms, resistance fighters who operated behind our lines. They were led by a woman named Amanda Burke. Before the war, she was a strategic operations officer. She understood exactly how to hurt an occupying force. Zekthor described how the Phantoms operated. Small cells of fighters who struck without warning and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. They sabotaged supply lines, destroyed communications equipment, and made it impossible for the Krillian forces to maintain control. Burke's tactics were brilliant and brutal, Zekthor said. She knew we needed supplies from the homeworlds. She knew we needed communication networks to coordinate. She knew we needed local infrastructure to maintain our occupation. And she systematically destroyed all of it. The footage showed the aftermath of Phantom attacks. Burning supply depots, collapsed communications towers, ambushed patrol units. The Krillian forces had tried everything to stop them, but the humans were always one step ahead. They could survive in environments that killed my people, Zekthor explained. They needed less food, less water, less sleep. They could hide in places we couldn't go. They could endure conditions we couldn't tolerate. And they never stopped fighting. One cadet asked, "Why didn't we just hunt them down?" Zekthor laughed bitterly. "We tried. We sent entire battalions to find and destroy the Phantom cells. Do you know what happened? The battalions disappeared. The humans knew the terrain better than we did. They set traps, ambushes, and snares. They turned their own worlds into hunting grounds, where we were the prey." He pulled up a specific operation file. "This is the mission that made me truly understand human determination. A rescue operation at Detention Facility 17. We were holding 47 human prisoners there. High-value targets, officers, scientists, engineers. People the resistance wanted back. The facility appeared on screen. A heavily fortified complex, surrounded by defensive positions and guard towers. It looked impregnable. Burke assigned the mission to Sergeant Kevin Brooks and Corporal Nicole Stevens, Zekthor said. They were given a team of 12 soldiers. The mission profile showed less than 5% chance of success. 0 chance that the rescue team would survive. Even if they got the prisoners out, they wouldn't make it back alive. He paused, letting that sink in. They volunteered anyway. All 12 of them. Zekthor described the operation in detail. Brooks and Stevens had studied the facility for weeks, learning guard patterns and security protocols. They had identified weaknesses in the defenses that the Krillians didn't even know existed. They infiltrated during a storm, Zekthor said. A massive electrical storm that knocked out some of our sensors. They cut through the perimeter fence, disabled the backup generators, and entered the facility while my people were trying to restore power. The rescue team had moved through the facility like ghosts. Silent, efficient, deadly. They killed guards without raising alarms. They disabled security systems without being detected. They reached the detention block in less than 20 minutes. The prisoners were in bad shape, Zekthor said quietly. We had interrogated them for months. Some could barely walk. But Brooks got them moving. Stevens organized them into groups and assigned each prisoner to a team member. Getting into the facility had been difficult. Getting out with 47 prisoners was supposed to be impossible. But the humans had planned for everything. They set charges throughout the facility, Zekthor explained. Timed explosives that created chaos and confusion. While we were responding to fires and explosions on one side of the complex, they were evacuating prisoners on the other side. But things went wrong at the perimeter. A Krillian patrol spotted the escaping prisoners and raised the alarm. What followed was a running battle through hostile territory with wounded prisoners and overwhelming enemy forces. Stevens took half the team and the fastest-moving prisoners and ran for the extraction point, Zekthor said. Brooks took the other half and the wounded prisoners and went the opposite direction. He drew our forces away from Stevens, sacrificing himself so others could escape. The footage showed the aftermath. Brooks and his team had fought a running battle for 6 kilometers through rough terrain. They had held off pursuing Krillian forces for 3 hours, buying time for Stevens to reach safety with the prisoners. When we finally cornered Brooks, he was alone, Zekthor said. His entire team was dead. He was wounded in 7 places. But he was still fighting, still buying time, still making sure the mission succeeded. Brooks had killed 18 Krillian soldiers before being captured. He had been too valuable to execute, so they took him prisoner and tried to extract information about the resistance. He told them nothing. He died 3 days later from his wounds, Zekthor said, but not before getting confirmation that all 47 prisoners had reached friendly territory. His last words were asking if they made it. When told they had, he smiled and closed his eyes. The room was deathly quiet. The cadets stared at Zekthor with expressions of shock and disbelief. Stevens survived, Zekthor continued. She got every single prisoner to safety. 47 humans rescued from what should have been an impregnable facility. And the cost was 12 human soldiers who knew they wouldn't survive but volunteered anyway. He pulled up intercepted communications from before the mission. Brooks had recorded messages for his family. He had arranged for his personal belongings to be distributed. He had written letters to be delivered after his death. He knew he was going to die, and went, anyway. That is what Burke called the Ghost Protocol, Zekthor said. No prisoner left behind if there was any chance of rescue, regardless of cost. And the humans meant it. Regardless of cost, regardless of odds, regardless of survival rates. He looked at the young cadets. We held hundreds of human prisoners during the war. Do you know how many successful rescue operations the Resistance launched? 47. 47 times they attacked our facilities, our convoys, our detention centers. Not all succeeded, but they never stopped trying. Zekthor turned off the display. The phantoms made occupation impossible. Every supply convoy needed heavy escorts. Every facility needed massive defenses. Every patrol risked ambush. We controlled the territory on maps, but the humans controlled it in reality. They made us bleed. For every day, we occupied their worlds. The old soldier looked tired now. The memories weighed heavily on him. Burke and her fighters taught me that conquering humans is not enough. You have to break their will. And human will cannot be broken. They will fight from the shadows, strike without warning, and never surrender. Never. The cadets left the lecture hall in silence, each one contemplating what they had learned. The humans were not just warriors. They were survivors who refused to stay defeated, no matter how hopeless the situation appeared. The fourth lecture drew the largest crowd yet. Cadets from other classes had requested permission to attend. Even some instructors stood at the back of the hall, curious to hear Zekthor's stories. The old veteran had become famous throughout the academy. Zekthor stood before them, looking older and more tired than before. The memories he was sharing took a toll on him, but he continued, because the young needed to understand what their empire had faced. "Today I will tell you about the darkest time of the war," he began. "The period when we thought we had won. When we controlled most of human space and believed their surrender was inevitable. We were wrong. The humans had one more strategy." He displayed a tactical map showing Krillian control across human territory. 70% of human space was marked in red. Only a few scattered systems remained in human hands. "We expected peace negotiations," Zekthor said. "We expected humanity to accept client species status under the Empire. Instead, they activated something called the Long Dark Protocol." The map changed, showing human fleet movements. Instead of consolidating their remaining forces for a desperate last stand, the human ships scattered in every direction. They dispersed into deep space, reorganizing into small, independent units. Admiral Chris Martinez commanded what was left of the human fleet, Zekthor explained. He was a brilliant strategist who understood one simple truth. We could not hold what we could not defend. And we could not defend everything. Martinez had ordered a complete transformation of human military doctrine. No more fleet battles. No more attempts to hold territory. Instead, every ship became a raider. Every unit became a strike force. The humans would make occupation cost everything. They called it the Long Dark because their ships operated in deep space for months at a time, Zekthor said. No support, no resupply, no reinforcements. Just small vessels hunting our convoys and installations like predators in the night. He pulled up the service record of a ship called the Relentless, a small corvette commanded by Lieutenant Ashley Quinn. The ship's accomplishments were staggering. Quinn and her crew operated independently for 14 months, Zekthor said. 14 months without returning to base, without resupply from friendly forces, without rest. They raided our convoys, destroyed our infrastructure, and vanished before we could respond. The cadets stared at the numbers on screen. 83 Krillian vessels destroyed or damaged by one small ship. It seemed impossible. They survived by recycling everything, Zekthor explained. They grew food in makeshift hydroponics, using salvaged equipment. They maintained their ship with parts taken from our destroyed vessels. They went months without proper rest, pushing human endurance to its absolute limits. The footage showed the Relentless when it finally returned to human space. The ship looked ancient, held together with improvised repairs and salvaged components. The crew had aged years in appearance, their faces gaunt and haunted, but they had succeeded. Quinn's ship was just one of hundreds, Zekthor said. Hundreds of human vessels doing the same thing across all of occupied space. Every convoy we sent needed escorts. Every supply line became contested. Every parsec of space became dangerous. Every sawn, one cadet asked, "Couldn't you just increase security?" Zekthor laughed without humor. "We tried. We assigned escorts to every convoy. We fortified every installation. We patrolled every trade route. Do you know what that required? It required stretching our forces across thousands of light years. It required dedicating enormous resources just to maintain what we had conquered." The old soldier described how the Long Dark shattered Krillian logistics. Ships that should have been fighting were instead guarding convoys. Troops that should have been advancing were instead defending supply depots. The entire war machine ground to a halt, choking on its own supply lines. On the ground, The humans did the same thing. Zekthor continued. Captain Brandon Cole led a unit that operated behind our lines for 8 months. 8 months living off the land, supplied only by occasional airdrops, constantly on the move. Cole's unit had destroyed 42 communications relays, ambushed 68 patrols, and made occupation impossible without massive troop commitments. They struck without warning and vanished into terrain they knew better than any Krillian scout. We sent 3 battalions to hunt Cole, Zekthor said. 3,000 soldiers dedicated to finding and destroying one company of 200 humans. Do you know how many we found? None. They moved like shadows, struck like lightning, and disappeared like smoke. The Long Dark changed the entire nature of the war. The Krillian Empire controlled the territory on paper, but they couldn't use it. They couldn't move supplies safely. They couldn't maintain communications reliably. They couldn't project power without exposing themselves to raids. Every day cost us more, Zekthor explained. Ships destroyed, installations sabotaged, soldiers killed in ambushes. The humans weren't winning battles, but they were making the war too expensive to continue. He displayed casualty figures and resource expenditures. The numbers told a grim story. The Empire was bleeding resources faster than they could be replaced. The economy was straining under the cost of maintaining the occupation. Political support for the war was collapsing. Martinez understood something we didn't, Zekthor said. Wars are not won by conquering territory. They are won by breaking the enemy's will to fight. And he was breaking our will, one convoy at a time, one installation at a time, one soldier at a time. The footage showed more examples of human raids. A supply depot destroyed by a team of infiltrators. A command center sabotaged by a single engineer who had hidden in the ventilation system for 3 days. A fuel convoy ambushed by fighters who appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. The humans had learned from thousands of years of warfare on their homeworld, Zekthor said. They knew that a determined enemy can always find ways to resist. They knew that occupation requires resources an attacker often doesn't have. They knew how to turn our size and strength into weaknesses. He pulled up a tactical analysis written by Krillian High Command. The document admitted what everyone already knew, but didn't want to say out loud. The war was becoming unsustainable. Victory was no longer possible. The best the Empire could hope for was a negotiated peace. The Long Dark didn't win battles, Zekthor repeated. It didn't capture territory. It didn't destroy our fleet. But it did something more important. It made continuing the war impossible. Every day we stayed cost more than we gained. Every week the situation got worse. Every month our forces grew more stretched, more exhausted, more demoralized. The old veteran looked at the young cadets. Quinn, Cole, Martinez, and thousands of others like them operated in conditions that would have broken most species. They went months without rest, years without relief, with no promise of victory or survival. They fought not because they expected to win, but because surrender was not an option. Zekthor turned off the display. The humans taught us that conquest is easy, occupation is hard, and occupying a species that refuses to be occupied is impossible. They made us realize that winning battles meant nothing if we couldn't end the war. And the war would never end, as long as humans continued to fight. The lecture hall emptied slowly. The cadets were beginning to understand why the Empire had sued for peace, not because they were defeated militarily, but because the humans had demonstrated they would never stop resisting, never stop fighting, never accept occupation as a permanent condition, and that made victory meaningless. The final lecture arrived on a cold morning. Zekthor entered the hall to find every seat filled, and dozens more students standing. Word had spread throughout the entire academy that the famous veteran was concluding his testimony about the human war. Even the academy commandant attended, standing quietly at the back. Zekthor took his place at the front and looked out at the assembled faces. 5 days of stories had brought them to this moment. The moment when the proud Krillian Empire had admitted defeat and sued for peace. "Today, I will tell you how the war ended," he began. "Not with a final battle or a glorious victory, but with a negotiation table and the terrible realization of what we had fought." The room fell silent. Everyone knew the Empire had made peace with humanity, but few knew the details. Those negotiations were classified, discussed only in the highest levels of government. But Zekthor had been there. He had witnessed everything. "The Empire's high command called for peace talks," Zekthor said. "After 3 years of war, after conquering most of human space, after victories that should have ended the conflict, we asked for negotiations. Does that seem strange to you?" Given. Several cadets nodded. It did seem strange. The Empire had won most of the battles. They controlled most of the territory. Why would they be the ones asking for peace? "High Commander Vex Lar led our delegation," Zekthor explained. He was a brilliant strategist, a decorated warrior, a leader who had never known defeat. And he sat across from Ambassador Kate Richardson, a human diplomat, and asked her to discuss terms. Zekthor had attended as a military advisor. He remembered that first meeting with perfect clarity. Richardson had walked into the room with quiet confidence, carrying herself like someone who held all the advantages despite her species being on the verge of defeat. Vexlar opened with what he thought was a reasonable position, Zekthor said. The Empire would retain control of the outer colonies. Humanity would accept client species status. Trade agreements would favor Krillian interests. In exchange, the fighting would stop. He paused, remembering Richardson's reaction. She had listened without expression, then calmly refused every term. "Richardson told us that humanity would accept nothing less than complete withdrawal to pre-war boundaries," Zekthor said. "She told us that every occupied world would be returned. Every human prisoner would be exchanged. And there would be no reparations, no punitive terms, no client species status." One cadet spoke up. "But we held all the territory. How could she demand such terms?" Zekthor smiled sadly. "That is what Vexlar asked. He pointed out that humanity had lost 40% of its military forces, that 300 million civilians had died, that their economy was devastated and would take generations to rebuild. He asked why they thought they could demand anything when they were clearly losing." Richardson's response had changed everything. She had calmly pulled out a datapad and displayed detailed military plans for the next phase of human operations, strategies for taking the war to Krillian home systems, projections showing humanity could sustain the conflict for another 20 years if necessary. "She showed us plans for attacks on our core worlds," Zekthor said quietly. "Raids on our industrial centers, strikes against our infrastructure. She demonstrated that humanity had the capability and the will to bring the war to us, to make our home systems as dangerous as the occupied territories." The old soldier described how the negotiation room had fallen silent. Vexlar and the other Krillian officers had reviewed the human plans with growing horror. Everything was detailed, practical, achievable. The humans weren't bluffing. They were showing the Empire exactly what would happen if the war continued. "Then Richardson said something that haunts me still," Zekthor continued. She said, "We don't want to destroy your empire. We don't want revenge or conquest. We simply want to be left alone. But if you force us to continue fighting, we will burn your worlds like you burned ours. We will fight in your cities, your homes, your streets, and we will never stop." Vexlar had asked the question that everyone was thinking, the question that defined the entire negotiation. "Why didn't you surrender when you were losing? You could have saved millions of lives." Richardson's answer became famous in both human and Krillian space. Zekthor repeated it now for the cadets. "Because some things are worse than death, and some things are worth dying for. Our freedom is both." The room remained absolutely silent. The cadets were beginning to understand. Vexlar was a proud warrior, Zekthor said. But he was not a fool. He looked at Richardson's plans and realized the truth. The Empire could not win. Not because we lacked the strength or the technology or the numbers. We could not win because humans would never stop fighting, never accept defeat, never surrender their freedom. The negotiations had continued for weeks. The final terms were generous, far more generous than the Krillian Empire deserved. Complete withdrawal from occupied territory, exchange of all prisoners, no reparations demanded by either side, a mutual non-aggression pact and trade agreements that benefited both species equally. Richardson gave us an honorable peace, Zekthor said. She could have demanded much more. She could have humiliated us. But she didn't. She offered us a way to end the war with dignity, to withdraw without shame, to rebuild our relationship as equals rather than enemies. The old veteran described the final prisoner exchange. He had been present when the Krillian captives returned home. He had also seen the human prisoners being released. I met a man named Colonel Nathan Grant, Zekthor said. He had spent 3 years in our detention facility. We had interrogated him for information about human military operations. We had offered him better treatment in exchange for cooperation. He told us nothing. Grant had been tortured, starved, isolated, subjected to every method the Krillians knew to break a prisoner's will. But he never broke. He never betrayed his people. He never gave up hope. When I asked how he survived, how he endured 3 years of captivity without breaking, he said something simple, Zekthor explained. He said, "I knew my people were still fighting. I couldn't let them down." That was the moment Zekthor truly understood. Humans didn't fight for abstract concepts or political systems. They fought for each other. Every soldier knew that their comrades would never abandon them, never stop trying to rescue them, never surrender while they still lived. And that knowledge gave them strength that no torture could break. The peace treaty was signed 8 years ago, Zekthor said. Since then, there has been no conflict between our species. The border is peaceful. Trade flows freely. We have even begun cultural exchanges and cooperative research projects. He looked at each cadet in turn, making sure they understood the weight of his next words. But make no mistake, the peace is not maintained by the treaty. It is maintained by mutual respect forged in blood. The Krillian Empire learned a terrible lesson in that war. Some species cannot be conquered because they refuse to accept conquest as an option. Zekthor walked slowly to the front of the room. His age showed in every step, but his voice remained strong. Humans will endure any suffering, pay any cost, fight to their last breath for what they believe in. We won battles but couldn't win the war, because winning would have required killing every single human. And even then, I'm not sure the last human alive wouldn't find a way to fight back. The old soldier concluded his testimony with a warning. The peace between our species is precious. It must be maintained, because if war comes again, if we are ever foolish enough to fight humanity a second time, they will not offer generous terms, they will not show mercy. They will remember what we did, and they will make us pay for every death, every burned world, every lost life. A young cadet in the front row raised his hand. Teacher, do you think we could ever defeat them, if war came again? Zekthor's answer was immediate and absolute. I pray to all the gods that we never have to try. Because I have seen what humans become when they fight for their survival. I have witnessed their courage, their determination, their absolute refusal to accept defeat, and I tell you now, with certainty, born from experience, the Krillian Empire could not survive another war with humanity. He looked at the commandant standing at the back of the room. The old officer nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of Zekthor's words. Humanity is the most dangerous force in the galaxy, Zekthor said. Not because of their weapons, or their technology, or their numbers. They are dangerous because their will cannot be broken. Their courage cannot be exhausted, and their determination cannot be defeated. Remember this lesson well. Remember it always, and pray that we never forget it. The lecture hall remained silent long after Zekthor left. The cadets sat with their own thoughts, processing everything they had learned over 5 days of testimony. They had come seeking stories of glory and victory. Instead, they had learned about an enemy that refused to be defeated, a species that valued freedom above life itself, and a war that could never truly be won. And they understood, perhaps for the first time, why the mighty Krillian Empire had sued for peace.